stories about wanderers and travelers have existed, it seems to me, as long as stories have existed. I've encountered them in the creation myths and the folk tales of tribal and aboriginal cultures. They also feature in the mythology and fables of ancient civilizations, and very often the heroes and heroines of epics and ballads are also travelers and wanderers. And these proto-stories have deeply influenced modern literature, from the Divine Comedy, Pilgrim's Progress, Candide, Don Quixote, all the way to Huckleberry Finn and beyond. Into this glorious pantheon of traveler literature, and very close to the top, I would also place Lone Wolf and Cub, the seminal manga written by Kazuo Koike and illustrated by Koseki Kojima. Lone Wolf and Cub not only borrows from that rich heritage, but also expands it in exciting and wonderful ways. It combines that ancient trope of the traveler on the open road with the more modern genre of revenge thriller. But its interpretation of the traveler on the open road as well as the revenge thriller are just two of the many reasons why this manga is a masterpiece. That's why in this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think this series is so special, and in particular, why I think this makes a great introduction to manga in general. This was the first manga I ever read, so some of these reasons would be from personal experience, but there are other things that I think make this a fantastic introduction to Japanese comics and comics from other cultures and other styles and other voices than one might be used to. So I'll ramble on a little bit about the many reasons I think Lone Wolf and Cub is a fantastic gateway into manga, while also being a superlative example of the form, and I'll briefly look at a couple of editions that you could read this series in. That's a fair amount to cover, so let's get on the road with Lone Wolf and Cub. So what is Lone Wolf and Cub? It is a manga that started being published in 1970, and by the time it finished its story, took up 28 such small volumes. It told the story of Ogami Ito, who played the role of Shogun's executioner. Now, this is going to be my very garbled digest form of it, so let me know in the comments below everything I got wrong. But in feudal era Japan, which is when this story is set, the shogun ruled over a whole number of nobles who were constantly warring with each other and jockeying for power and even trying to take over the position of the shogun themselves. In order to protect himself, he relied on three main pillars of strength. One was his network of assassins, the second was his network of spies, and his third was a single individual, the executioner. Ogami Ito, the hero of Lone Wolf and Cub, is the shogun's executioner, the person who enforces the shogun's will and makes sure those who have been sentenced to commit ritual suicide are beheaded. Ritual suicide, seppuku, is this extremely painful self-disembowelment that people have to commit when they've dishonored the clan or dishonored the shogunate. Some people may not agree that they should do this, and so therefore Ogami Ito plays the role of enforcer of the law and also serves as the person who commits the beheading once this painful process has started as an act of mercy. He is a warrior of unmatched power and skill, which you think you would have to have this job. Ogami Ito, at the beginning of this story, finds his family murdered except for his newborn infant son, and has been framed by a particular clan to fall out of favor, to appear as if he is behaving treasonously against the shogun. He is then condemned to commit the ritual suicide himself and kill his baby son. This is when he decides to reject that law. He knows that it's unfair, he knows that it's untrue, and he decides not to commit suicide, be dishonored, and try to take revenge on the people who have ruined his life and destroyed his family. He offers his infant son a choice between a sword and a ball. If his son Daigoro selects the ball, he will send him to heaven to be with his mother. But if he picks the way of the sword, he will accompany his father on the road to hell, the road to revenge through dishonor. And that's where the series takes off. It is One man, a lone wolf, and his cub in a baby cart traveling across feudal era Japan, which is filled with violence of all kinds, between clans, between individuals, villages, against women, and he hires himself out as an assassin while he gathers his resources to take his revenge. The 28 volumes that make up this series tell the story of his travels across the lands, meeting a variety of people, many of them with very different views than his, and how he deals with himself and his son being condemned to this dishonorable life but seeing no other way out than revenge. So already you've got two central themes and tropes that will run through the entire series. One of revenge, something that we have seen before and will continue to see again, something that runs all the way from the Count of Monte Cristo to John Wick, and the deep historical and cultural details that inform every part of its plot. Lone Wolf and Cub is very much about its time and place, but its attention to detail, not just in the costumes and the landscape and the architecture, which are impeccable, but also as far as the psychology of individuals are concerned, what they think of as duty, what they think of as morality. The idea that he is a hired assassin means that he works for whoever pays for him. So, for example, someone might hire him to kill their father so that they can get an inheritance. Someone else may hire him to kill an informant so that their plot doesn't get revealed to someone else who they were plotting against. The morality of these actions exist in a completely different context than what you and I might think of in absolute terms. Everyone is right in their own way. It's all about who can pay for whom. But Ogami Ito still has his own code, even though he considers himself a damned man, even though he considers himself a dishonored man. And not all stories go in the way that you're expecting, even though what you're expecting keeps changing based on the last stories you read. So what makes this series so special and what makes it a fantastic introduction to manga is really this twin notion of something familiar and something very, very new. We are used to stories of travelers. They are a very natural way for us to move from environment to environment, context to context, situation to situation, while having a sort of anchor character who we can have as our proxy, but also we can see them grow and change according to what they encounter. This gives us a lot of variety without losing our bearings and is a classic form of storytelling. You've got the revenge thriller in which you are really rooting for someone because of the injustice done to them. So therefore, a lot of their actions, even though violent, might seem to us to be justified because we are hurt by the same injustice that hurt them. And at the same time, you're getting this culture with its belief systems, with its rituals, with its strict adherence to codes of Bushido, of honor, the way of the samurai, the dishonored samurai, what it means to be a ronin, what the peasant class thinks of the warrior class, how the nobles live off the land. Very different from things that we might be used to. Because we have something that's familiar, this new and unfamiliar thing is easier to digest. And the historical accuracy I mentioned means it's not a fantasy land. It's based on research and it gives you a glimpse into a culture that you may not know a lot about. And this combining of what we're familiar with what we may not be familiar with also applies to comic storytelling. Another reason why Lone Wolf and Cub might be the perfect first manga to read is because a lot of people might be intimidated by a form that is so different from what they're used to. If you're used to reading Tintin and Asterix and Lucky Luke or European comics from a certain time, if you're used to reading only American superhero comics, or if you're used to reading only Disney talking animal funny comics, whatever it may be, the black and white nature of manga, the voluminous content, how many pages, the density of panels, as well as the vocabulary of how we're moving from place to place might seem very alien and unfortunately off-putting. But Lone Wolf and Cub is above all cinematic. It uses the vocabulary of movies, whether it's in jump cuts or transitions or showing you small elements within a larger thing, a blade of grass while a battle is going on that gets spattered by blood, for example, that we're actually familiar with. And this is not really surprising because Lone Wolf and Cub in 1970 was influenced very heavily by the samurai films of of Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa himself is very influenced by American westerns and European film in using techniques to tell stories that were deeply about Japanese culture and Japanese history. And so therefore you've got this circle of familiarity in which people borrow elements from other cultures in order to tell new stories that are not really that alien to the cultures that had the elements borrowed from them. And westerns are the perfect example. You've got these old black and white westerns that create a certain sort of mythology. Kurosawa loves that and tries to translate that into stories of Ronin and samurai and feudal era Japan. Those movies, as well as Lone Wolf and Cub being deeply influential, influence American comics and American movies. These familiar cinematic techniques are translated so beautifully in this manga that the pace, rhythm, and focus of the comic, even though it's different from other comics you've read, feel familiar. This actually helps you learn how you should read this. A lot of manga is read at a much faster pace than many European and Western comics, and a lot of the images are just supposed to be there to be glanced over as you move on to the next one. It's not the individual image necessarily that's always creating the impact. It's the sequence of them and the way that by flowing from one to another, a sort of movie is being created in your head, but one that can be impressionistic instead of explicit. Lone Wolf and Cub does this perfectly. It gives you action scenes with one or two very notable exceptions that are very, very fast. They last for 2 or 3 panels, but the setup and the repercussions echo longer. This creates a sense of tension and waiting for something that is over in a second but hits you with a lot of impact, very different from the more extended fight scenes and punching fests that people might be used to. The way that characters interact with each other and talk to each other is equally balanced. You get a lot of exposition because people are explaining their position, they're explaining the way they think, they're explaining why they're doing the things they're doing. At the same time as they're trying to get the other person to see their way, they're also looking for a way in which they can kill that other person, in which they can get the upper hand physically and through violence, if not through their words and ideas. This is, again, a very unusual way of creating tension and action, one that is unique because of the cultural aspects of these philosophies, of these explanations, but also for you as the reader, as you feel your loyalties shifting one way or the other. There are at least a dozen situations in which Ugami Ito kills somebody that you feel really, really bad about. You understand his journey, you understand why he has to do what he has to do, but you also feel the loss of a particular philosophy, of a particular soul from the world, which is very unique in a book that has so much bloodshed and such a high body count. The quality of the storytelling, both the writing and the art being matched so perfectly, its tone, its attitude, its relentless violence, yet the beauty of the landscape serving as a contrast, the serenity of the environments serving as a contrast to this dismemberment and killing of horses and some horrible, extremely violent things. I would in fact go so far as to say that not only is Lone Wolf and Cub a great first manga to read, in many ways it is a great first comic to read. Now I mean that for adults because there are adult themes, serious questions, and sex and nudity in this series, so I don't mean as a good first comic to read for anyone, but for people who are interested in the capabilities of the medium, this tells you long form, serious, historically researched, entertaining, pot boiling, what we in India call masala storytelling, done in a very artistic, expressionistic, impressionistic, whatever you want, it's there. This is something that's exploring the boundaries of comics by taking a variety of traditions, putting them all together, and then redrawing certain boundaries, telling you this is what comic storytelling can be. And because of its combination of the new and the old, of the familiar and the unfamiliar, it becomes a journey that almost anyone can go on and really enjoy. Now, part of the reason I think all of this is because Lone Wolf and Cub, as I mentioned, was the first manga I ever read. The introduction that it gave to me was of the highest standard. Immediately, I had no doubt in my mind that manga was as vibrant, maybe more than European or American comics, at least the ones that I had been exposed to at that time. But it also gave me, as I said, an idea idea of how serious and how entertaining at the same time comic storytelling could be. I read it in these editions from Dark Horse Comics that were published from 2000 onwards, I think. They replicated the size of the original Japanese publications, but did flip them around for reading, which means that you would read this in the Western tradition rather than from this side onwards as you normally would with manga. That also meant that the art was flipped to be read left to right. There were 28 of these volumes. I used to have about 7 or 8 of them. These are not mine. I had to give them away when I moved just because I couldn't afford to move all the books I had. These volumes are borrowed from a friend of mine, but mine looked just as yellowed and just as frayed as these did when I gave them away. Of course, if you're able to pick up new copies and maintain them better than a student would, you would have them look like this. However, these editions are now out of print. You can still find them online in individual as well as the full collection forms like on eBay, but I think they can be pretty expensive. Although that does not mean that Lone Wolf and Cub is out of print in English. Dark Horse continue to publish it now in these new Omnibus volumes. Each of these is much thicker than the original volumes. They contain between 2 and 3 of the original volumes and also a larger format in size. I know a lot of people who bemoan the passing of these wonderful, cute little editions and don't really like these big ones. But perhaps blasphemously, I'll have to say that I sort of prefer these volumes to these ones, in spite of their aesthetic appeal and fidelity to the original format. There are a couple of reasons for that, so let's take a closer look and I'll try to explain to you why I have that opinion. The Dark Horse editions of Lone Wolf and Cub saw the first time that this series was completed in English. There was an earlier attempt to bring this series to American audiences by First Comics, who published them in regular comic-sized issues. They got to issue 45. I think there needed to be 120 of those thinner pages, but 28 volumes of these editions by Dark Horse did complete the series. Apart from the long-delayed availability of this classic series in English, the format was perhaps the most attractive draw for these editions. Published in the dimensions of manga volumes in Japan, particularly the way that this book was published in Manga Action, I think. This may have been the first time American audiences saw this format applied to an English language comic book. Literally fitting on the palm of your hand, but thick, around 300 pages. This was an exciting and new way for many people to read comics. As mentioned, these comics did read in the Western style from left to right with the spine on the right side, and the small size did preserve the original effect of seeing each page in its entirety before reading individual panels. As we can see, in many cases, it is the accumulation of the panels that really gives the story its drive, although that certainly doesn't mean that they're light in detail. These editions are a pleasure to read, fitting as snugly as they do in your hand, very portable, but also the nature of the comic is something that allows you to go through these 300 pages much faster than you would think you would. With these 28 volumes no longer being printed by Dark Horse, they have been replaced by the Lone Wolf and Cub Omnibus volumes, which are substantially larger both in length, breadth, and thickness. Each omnibus volume collects about 2.5 volumes of the original series, completing the entire story in 12 volumes instead of 28. Now, quite apart from the fact that this is the only way to get them nowadays, and even these copies may not be long in print from what I can see, at least based upon availability in India, those make it automatically a great way to collect the series in fewer volumes than before. But as I mentioned earlier, I believe I prefer these volumes to these ones. There's no denying the charm of these volume sizes, the way the design works, and of course it's an absolutely true point that this is how the series was originally read, albeit the other way around. But the reason I love this edition as much as I do is because I honestly feel that the art of Lone Wolf and Cub is simply spectacular, irrespective of the fact that it is so dense, irrespective of the fact that the entire series runs for almost 9,000 pages. There aren't really any filler or wasted panels in the series. Even the most minimal of panels have a lot to appreciate within them, and the original format, in my opinion, tended to crowd out the details. As well as heavier blacks would become muddy and run into each other. The painterly grey washes were not always appreciable, and those are things that I think are rectified. Now, I know that a lot of manga is published in this smaller size, and I know a lot of the art is purposefully sketchy in order to get you from page to page. I find looking at this art in larger panels to be a more pleasurable experience. I think it does justice to the artwork and the layout, and even reading the text and the narration for me in this larger format is far easier. I'll try and illustrate my point just by looking at the first couple of pages of the series in both formats, where immediately I noticed that I don't see the writing on the flag that I do in the larger edition. In the smaller edition, the black is very hard to tell against the gray. And I understand the pages are yellowed, but I think this was difficult no matter what. Similarly, the texture of the wood, the shadowiness of the shadows, the details on the sleeping baby are all far clearer in this new edition. The early issues also contained a lot of filled in blacks, but also grey tones, I think is the word, which, while not indiscernible, was certainly harder to make out in the earlier edition. The movement across the page to me remains unaffected. While it is true that I may have earlier read this page in 1.5 seconds, and maybe this one takes me 2 seconds or 2.5 seconds to read, the proportionate amount of time I spend on each panel to me remains the same. Because I'm dividing my attention in exactly the same way as I did previously, the pacing and the speed of the story remains unchanged by having larger pages. These are not so oversized that you're really slowing down to look at each panel. You still see it in one glimpse, you still run through it in the same way, and if you take a little extra time on each one, I think, at least for me, it's more an enhancement than a hindrance. There is, of course, the loss of the absolute portability of something this size, as well as the thickness, which meant that no matter where you were in the book, you could pretty much open it and read it very comfortably. But even with this bulk, the pages open flat very easily no matter where you are in the book. And it's not really too heavy or too cumbersome to keep you from reading in bed, for example. Of course, you're not really going to go wrong no matter which one you pick, but if you were worried about not having the original manga size and not wanting to get something that looked so big, thinking it wouldn't be the same experience, I can comfortably say from at least my point of view that there is no loss, and in fact, you might be gaining something from these new editions. Over the years, Dark Horse has published other editions of Lone Wolf and Cub of particular volumes, but they seem to be limited edition hardcovers that are very hard to find and very expensive. Although not cheap, one edition that is still easily available is this, the gallery edition of Lone Wolf and Cub. But rather than tack on a look at this to the end of this video, I think I'm going to make a special video on this edition, something that won a viewer poll here on our community page and therefore deserves a special look. So if you're not already subscribed, do so and hit that notification bell to be updated on when that happens. Honestly, it's hard for me to overstate how magnificent I find this series. If you've never read any manga, I would highly recommend this as your first manga. It will set the bar really high and be an excellent read in the process. If you have read manga and haven't read Lone Wolf and Cub, what are you waiting for? And if you have read Lone Wolf and Cub, I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. This has been For the Love of Comics. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.